What's up, team? I figured I'd make a video because a question that I get asked a lot is, what is my favorite snake? Which is always a terribly hard question to answer, and then I may have a different answer depending on what month it is or even what week it is, but consistently my olive python is always one of my favorite snakes. I always kind of preach to not handle your snakes as much and to stress them out as little as possible, but I see myself bringing out my olive python just to handle more than any other snake that I have in my collection. So let me tell you a few things about olive pythons, why they're good for me, and if you're considering getting one, all the factors that go into keeping them. This is going to be a little bit of a review. I'm going to go through all of the
Captain Insano shows no mercy.
Snakes that I have and kind of review the different pros and cons and kind of come up with a rating system on how to judge what snake might be right for you. So this here is an olive python. The olive python is going to be in the same genus as like the water python that I have, or Savu pythons. They're going to be in the genus Liasis. These snakes do get pretty big. They can get up to 14 feet and about 40 pounds. They are a native Australian species. There are two subspecies, which are going to be the Baroni, which are going to be in Western Australia, and then the olivaceus, which is going to be in Northern Australia and Queensland. Are semi-arboreal, especially as young snakes, and seem to be very, very active, have pretty high metabolisms. They're going to be pretty similar to those who keep retics. From what I hear, they do have pretty similar tendencies to a retic, but they're not going to get as big. They're going to stay, most specimens staying around 10 feet. And then olive pythons, they do come in this natural color, which, I mean, they call them olive pythons because they do keep this olive tone throughout their whole lives. I mean, they're very gray as babies and then kind of get to a grayish, greenish color and more of an olive color as adults. And the only morph that I know of right now on the market is going to be the albinos, which are going to be pretty much a solid yellow snake. They're going to be a little bit of a mellow yellow color and then just consistently one color, just like the normal coloration olive pythons. That's pretty much it for the general overview. Let's go into how I rate these guys. So I think people are usually concerned with, especially with getting a python, what their temperament's like. And olive pythons, just like most other snakes and especially pythons, are going to be much more defensive and food aggressive when they're babies. So if you're a little snake out there, there's a lot of things that could come around and eat you, so that's why they're much more defensive. I'm going to show you this video of my olive python when I first got her. She would strike the side of the tub pretty much every time I walked in the room. Also, there's one time where snake hooking her and she started going up the hook and she seemed really calm, so I just let her do it. And then right as soon as she got to my finger, she didn't really do a strike like most snakes would do. She just kind of put her head up against my finger and then opened her mouth and bit down and wrapped around. So that was a little bit different than any other python I've had, but they're definitely a little bit hard to handle as babies. And I mean, there is going to be different temperaments between different individuals of snakes, so you can't just draw a line and say that they're all aggressive or none of them are aggressive, but I can say that they definitely do tame down by age, but they're always food aggressive. So she won't come out and bite me, but then again, I don't go in there and as soon as I open up the tub, go to pick her up, put my hand in front of her face. She hasn't bit me since she was a baby, and I trust her pretty much more than any of my other snakes, but I still know that her first instinct when I open that tub is going to be to eat. So I do keep that in mind. So you definitely want to open up that tub and wait a second for them to get past that food response. Maybe even hook them at first and then pick them up from behind and start handling. Once they realize that there's no food, you're totally fine. I would say as far as temperament goes, I'd give them 3 out of 5 stars because they're not going to be very aggressive once they're out of their enclosure, but they're also not a snake that you can just go up and pick up right away and, handle without any experience. And then it's very important to understand you may be buying a baby snake, but that snake's not going to stay a baby for very long. So how big does an olive python get? Olive pythons are a pretty big species. Olive pythons can get up to about 14 feet, but most specimens are going to stay about 10-foot range. As with all snakes, the more you feed them, the more they grow. I definitely wouldn't go crazy on feeding. You can definitely put in larger meals to these guys, but you don't have to go anything over a large rat. A lot of breeders keep larger breeding females on only, maybe 2 large rats every couple weeks. So you don't have to go on to rabbits or anything like that. You want to have a lean bodied snake. You don't want a fat. This snake, if fed very well and grown very big, can be up to 40 pounds. So feeding is going to be large rats, and it's great because you don't have to go to rabbits, which are going to be less available, harder to get, and more expensive. That's definitely a plus. And now for feeding, I'm going to give them 4 out of 5 stars because they're always ready to eat. Unlike some other snakes, once you get them feeding on rodents, they're not going to go off feed very often, and they're going to be very, very ready to eat pretty much all the time. Now, as I said, these can get up to 14 feet. Most specimens are going to stay in the 10-foot range, but in order to house them, you're going to need pretty large cages. Breeders have noticed that it's actually harder to breed olive pythons in smaller enclosures, so it seems like one trick to get them to breed is to actually keep them in larger enclosures. And for example, the breeder who bred this, which is Jeff Hartwig, he keeps his adult female breeders in 8-foot long cages that are 4 feet high with obstacles in them and 2 feet deep. So that's pretty big in comparison to some of your modern day breeders who tend to keep larger snakes, maybe a 4-foot ball python, in tubs and stuff like that. So it's going to need a little bit more work on your part once this snake gets a little bit bigger. With that being said, this female I got in 2015, she's about 2 years old. She's being kept in a CB70 rack, which would be what you'd put an adult ball python in. She's doing great in that right now. Soon I'm gonna move her up probably to a 6 or 8-foot cage. I'm not worried about putting her in her adult enclosure when she's younger because, quite frankly, they like that space to move around. They are a very active snake in comparison to many of your other species of pythons. You're gonna see this snake roaming around a lot more than, say, obviously a ball python or even some of your carpet pythons. And also, it makes them really, really fun to handle because they're always climbing all around you like this. So for housing, I'm gonna give them 2 out of 5 stars because they're much more difficult to house than your average ball python, even a little bit more than a carpet python. You're not gonna be keeping these guys in tubs as adults. You're gonna have to make some arrangements in order to house these guys. Plus, it's not something you can easily just put in a rack system with a bunch of tubs. You're not gonna have 10 olive pythons without taking up a large amount of your space. And just like all other snakes, you need to pay attention to obviously humidity and heat. Although humidity is not a giant factor with these guys, I find that they have complete sheds pretty much no matter what. I mean, substrate, I'm keeping them on newsprint, just like I would some other pythons. I'm sure they do good on aspen or they do good on Reptile, but newspaper seems to be doing just fine for me, and I've never had a bad shed. And then also for heat, I've heard of some people keeping them up to 95 degrees, and I've heard of some people keeping them in the 80s. Personally, I keep them just like I keep all of my other Australian pythons. I keep them at about 86 degrees with a room temperature of about 74 degrees. That is a little bit cooler than a lot of people keep them. But even though I have a small sample size of maybe 5 or 6 jungle carpets and then also water python and an olive python, they've never had RIs, they've never had problems keeping them cooler. And they seem to do just as good, if not better, at that cooler temperature than when I've kept them at 88 degrees or 92 degrees. So that is just my personal observation. I mean, there's no step-by-step guide, exact way to do this. I mean, they're not dialed in as much as, say, a ball python, but they seem to do just fine at different temperatures and different humidity levels. For heat and humidity, I'm gonna give these guys, I mean, you can't keep them room temperature, obviously. I mean, that's a 5 out of 5, but for pythons, these are definitely great snakes to have, definitely easy to keep heat and humidity on. So I'm gonna give these 4 out of 5 stars.